lead poisoning is a huge issue in Baltimore City, and it has been for really the entire time that the city has existed.
Lead poisoning basically is an exposure to an environmental toxin or a poison that your child could be exposed to through lead paint, through cultural cosmetics that may have been used, medications, and it can cause injury to their brain.
A house that's built before 1978 is going to have still an 80% or higher chance that there's lead paint somewhere in the house. And the reason for this is that the lead industry 100 years ago was very strongly pushing lead-based paint as good paint. And the tragedy is that the lead industry at the time knew that lead could poison children.
So a child can be exposed to lead by the smallest amount. It would be comparable to about 3 to 5 granules of sugar being eaten each day. When the lead level goes up, it goes into the body by them either putting it directly into their mouth or breathing in lead dust. Lead is microscopic. You can't look at a windowsill and say, oh, this is dust, this is pollen, this is a dust bunny, and here's the lead. You can't separate it out that way.
I was diagnosed with lead poisoning around the age of 3 or 4.
I didn't find out till years later that I had it. I was in high school when I first found out I had it.
Long-term effects on their cognitive ability. They have decreased math skills, they may have an increase in dropout rate when they get a little bit older in school. During that time, we often find that they have presented signs of aggressive behavior, or they just can't stay on task.
My nephew Darnell in school, it was pretty hard for him. We tried to get him in several programs like Job Corps, couldn't complete that. GED program, couldn't get through that. So when we was younger, he definitely had an anger problem. He was real aggressive.
His attitude, like he used to always want to fight.
Coming up, you wouldn't even think that he had an issue or a problem. You just thought it was a typical child being a child. But as he got older, zap out, spaz out. Like you can just look at him wrong and he'd go off.
I would take things probably like a little too far, like something that caused it called for a reaction, but it's not the reaction that I gave, like fighting, cursing people out, like really bad, just doing things impulsively.
The main law that controls lead poisoning cases, and back then it did and now it still does, is the Baltimore City Housing Code. It comes down to whether, if there is an insurance company, you can make a settlement with the insurance company. If you can't make a settlement, then you have to put the case on in front of the jury. And the jury decides how much money the child should get. And so the two parts of that decision are pain and suffering, which includes everything that a child goes through who has lead poisoning.
I'm compensated so when I turned 18, my mother set mine up a lot differently than a lot of people's was set up. So when I turned 18, I had got a lump sum, and every other year after that, I get a lump sum.
This whole process of Darnell getting this money was to provide for his family. Before he even got his money, our mom passed. So now that this guy that was once the same level as the next guy that ain't had nothing, now he's a target because everybody know that he have this money.
As far as the lump sum goes, I received one big amount at one time, but in my opinion, I don't think any amount of compensation could take away the lead poisoning.
The length of time that lead stays in the bone can be decades. This can last for 20, 40, 60 years. tests have been showing that when they do autopsies on people that are in their 80s, they've actually seen lead still in their brain cells and on their hair follicles.
Other than those guys who are getting paid to say lead doesn't cause an injury, now just about any doctor you talk to will say no child should have lead in their blood. It's going to cause damage at the cellular level.
Welcome back to Good News Baltimore. Today we sit down with one of the area's most dedicated advocates for the creation of healthy homes, Ruth Ann Norton. Ruth Ann Norton serves as president and CEO of Healthy Homes Initiative, and we're excited to dive into a conversation with her about the national and local issue of lead poisoning. Thank you for being with us today.
Oh, delighted to be here.
Well, let me just dive right into my first question. We spoke a little earlier about Maryland being one of the country's leading states when it comes to lead poisoning. Can you elaborate on some of the different avenues that come into play where people can actually be exposed to lead poisoning?
Yep, it used to be that Baltimore was the #1 city in the United States for the concentration of childhood lead poisoning. Just outside of where we are today, you could walk in any direction and have children with extraordinarily high levels of lead. But if you go into a home and see paint that looks like alligator skin, that you can crack, you can chip, it's almost assuredly lead-based paint. Older windows that go up and down create a lead dust that gets on a child's hands and into their mouth. That can come from doors that rub, it can come from chipping paint on a porch. But the net effect is it takes about 3 granules of sugar, the equivalent of that, of leaded dust to start to poison a child. And here's what that means to their brains. The sodium and creatine levels increase the same way that men who abuse steroids, right? That stories of violent behavior. Well, the same things start to happen to kids, except for it's way more dangerous on younger children. And what the result is reading disabilities, hearing loss, speech delays, but also aggressive and violent behavior. Kids who get poisoned by lead, they grow up and are often lost because they cannot compete in the classroom, they can't stay in a conversation, they have a quicker fuse. They're actually 7 times more likely to drop out of school. And all of this is unacceptable because every bit of it is preventable.
Right, well, let me ask you this. If a child is affected by lead poisoning versus an adult, what's the difference in how, those effects can manifest themselves?
Well, it's a bit of a dose response. It takes more lead ingestion into our system. But if I'm an adult today, and I am, exposed to lead poisoning or lead hazards, and I ingest that, it will increase my rate of kidney failure 8-fold. My potential for cardiac arrest and cardiac disease by 16 to 19%, and I have a 46% chance of early mortality because it stores in our bones, in our brains, and it can come back and re-leach in lots of situations in our life.
Right. Well, obviously it requires a lot of medical attention, and in order to get that medical attention that you need by something that is a liability that you did not cause on your own. How long does it take to really get the compensation for maybe a libel suit?
It can often be years, and depends on the circumstances. They could be suing a landlord who's hiding behind a limited liability corporation who keeps zero assets, has no insurance, and will be unlikely to recover. But we've also seen, as in the city of Baltimore, the Housing Authority of Baltimore City was sued and has now settled a number of their cases. So that answer, unfortunately, I don't have a great answer because it's all over the board. And the truth of the matter is most children poisoned by lead never receive any compensation for the damage that's done.
Those that do receive compensation, how important is it for us to educate them on using that compensation for medical treatment versus monetary gain?
Well, I think that again, there's very limited medical treatment. And once you are 16, 17, 18, and if that compensation is from when you were 2, 3, 4, there is literally nothing on a medical intervention that can be done. And I would tell you, Ashley, that I think one of the saddest days of my work has been when I was visited by a federal public defender for a young man who was being prosecuted for murder, and he had serious lead poisoning. And I also think about the Dawson family bombing, and the young man who firebombed that house and 5 people died had a history of just terribly high lead poisoning. And people over time really tried to help him, and yet we could not get under control that impulse. So we've paid a heavy price in this city, in cities across the country, and in places across the country, and we keep paying that price. And it's almost as if we can't get it right about guns, and we can't get it right about lead poisoning, and yet it's staring us right in the face to say, do this, and there's a better path over here. Right. I do think one of the things that we ought to do is really do better counseling on use of that money to get better housing and allow families whose children have been awarded money to be able to use that money to buy a home so that we don't have generational poisoning or other siblings getting poisoned. So, early intervention matters, prevention matters here, because actually prevention is the only cure for lead poisoning. It's quite sad that there's not some, magic medication that we can do that would make people better. It's just not there.
You mentioned earlier that children who are lead poisoned have a 7 times more chance of dropping out of school, but they're also 6 times more likely to become involved in the juvenile justice system. What's your overall stance on this?
I have long wondered where the outrage is that we kind of send kids down this path that we know if we don't improve their housing, if we don't really aggressively care about the health of a house that a child is growing up in, we pay for it. We all pay for it by the loss of opportunity, by the cost of incarceration, by the cost of special education. But where you find lead-based paint issues, you're likely also going to find issues that are causing kids to have asthma. The number one reason kids are missing school. It's a reason parents don't go to work because their kids are in the emergency room and not the classroom. We couple that with lead poisoning and we send kids to the classroom when they can get there and they can't read as well.
So this is clearly a major epidemic, right? So these kids are coming into the schools, they're dealing with some issues around their reading and their learning. Is there any type of training sensitivity that takes place in the public school system that can help kind of get these kids moving along in the right direction?
Well, there is testing. So now we require to, when you go into the public school system, when you go into childcare, when you go into preschool in Maryland, you must prove that your child was tested for lead if they live in an at-risk community. Teachers in special education and other programs are made aware of what to look for, but there is very little that can be done once the damage has occurred, even with the most amount of care.
Okay, Ruth Ann, could you elaborate a little more on how lead-based poisoning can actually affect the crime rates in our area?
Well, I can tell you that our jails are currently filled with young men and some young women that have been poisoned by lead. Yet, you know, what people often think of with lead poisoning is reading disabilities. It's kind of been stuck on that. And in fact, we probably have a much greater issue with violent behavior. And, you know, it was in the end of the 1990s, we had a police chief by the name of Thomas Frazier and the state attorney, Patricia Jessamy, and they both came to me together and said that they were tired of prosecuting in the juvenile court young people with histories of lead poisoning. And they helped us to get enforcement put in when Martin O'Malley became mayor and to reinstate enforcement of lead violations.
Wow. You have led the efforts in Maryland to reduce childhood lead poisoning by 98%. That is awesome. And you've helped develop 27 pieces of state and local legislation to prevent lead poisoning and create healthier homes. What statewide mandates and compliance requirements should property owners be aware of?
So if you own a property now before 1978, effective January of this year, we've expanded it to all rental properties 1978, you must have your home meet the standards required by the Maryland Lead Risk Reduction in Housing Law. So no chipping, peeling, flaking paint, those structural issues that cause that. You must have, and all of that work must be done in a lead-safe manner. The house must pass a lead dust clearance test. You have to provide education, and families have a right of redress if these things fail during their tenancy. We are also implementing a law in Maryland that for repair and renovation and painting, contractors, when they disturb lead-based paint in any home of any income level, rental or homeowner occupied properties, they too must pass a lead dust clearance test if it's more than, I think, 2 square feet.
So, Ruth Ann, many people may think lead poisoning is something of the past. Can you please address how important and truly toxic this issue is today?
Yeah, and toxic's the right word. I mean, we're living with the toxic legacy of lead-based paint. You know, in 1904, the board of directors of Sherwin-Williams said that they did not want to get into the lead-based paint business because it poisoned kids and that kids would die from it. And in 1908, they entered the market. I talked about the fact that the federal government mandated the use of lead-based paint, and it was used in very low-income housing and very wealthy housing because it was a durable paint. So it stayed in houses for decades before it became dangerous. And what we are living with are the choices made decades ago that are poisoning young kids today, and it's pervasive in over 85% of the housing stock in the city of Baltimore. It will be a long time before we can say that we have no lead-based paint. So we really have to be diligent and vigilant about how we maintain housing, to replace as many windows as we can, and to make sure that we support people in having housing that has at its heart a health-based standard and really prevents lead poisoning and asthma and those things that we can avoid such damage and cost. We spend $100 billion a year between lead poisoning and asthma on avoidable cost. That wouldn't we like to put that into a child's to education and innovation and development in communities that really need it.
Now, you lead a wonderful organization and initiative around green and healthy homes. What type of education does your organization provide homeowners, maybe even healthcare providers overall?
We try to get every healthcare provider in the city and in the region to refer us their children who have elevated blood lead levels or who they know families are living in older housing with poor housing conditions or unhealthy housing conditions. We go in and provide a comprehensive assessment. We look at energy efficiency, lead issues, asthma issues, health and safety issues in the home, and then we go in and fix houses. Looking at those issues and have received funding from the state, city, and foundations to do that. So we are on a path to create a revolution around healthy housing in America.
Wonderful. Now, how could I or how could someone in the community get involved to assist with lead poisoning prevention?
Well, we love volunteer advocates who do training in the community. We love the referrals for families that we can try to work with. 410-534-6477, or go on our website, which is www.greenandhealthyhomes.org or ghhi.org.
Wonderful. So Ruth Ann, after today, I really hope that we can get more people on the bandwagon to get behind the lead poisoning prevention. I know that I will. I'm very much interested, and now our viewers hopefully are in tune as well. So.
Well, we need all the help that we can possibly garner, and it's an important issue, and I appreciate that, so thank you very much.
And thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And we'll be right back with Good News Baltimore.